In the first 4 months of 1997, flooding throughout the Midwest caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage and displaced thousands of residents and businesses. In the northern Kentucky community of Falmouth, 12 inches of rain fell in 24 hours early in March, causing the Licking River to overrun its banks and sweep across the town. The flood literally immobilized residents, cutting off electricity and phone service and forcing 2,400 people to evacuate their homes.
About 11 o'clock, the water started coming in, and they were calling for us to evacuate, and by then it was almost too late. We got caught in the flood. We broke into a house and went up to the second floor of the house and waited to be rescued.
In terms of the flooding within the city of Falmouth, it is very unique in that in prior flood events across the country, which involve more of an immersion type of flooding with water backing into the town, the North Fork of the Licking River actually rose out of its banks, cut directly across town at a height exceeding the roof line of some single-story dwellings. It rose very fast, it caught the town off guard, and ultimately washed many dwellings, structures, trees, anything that could float away or become buoyant was washed downstream.
Days later, when the waters finally receded, what was left in the flood's wake was a wasteland of debris. Homes, possessions, and property all needed to be inventoried, evaluated, and cleaned up. As part of that cleanup effort, an EPA team was dispatched to Falmouth.
EPA became involved in the flood response after the state of Kentucky requested assistance through FEMA with the collection, recovery, and ultimate disposal of orphan drums, tanks, and containers that were washed away by the floodwaters.
Normally, when EPA responds to a drum cleanup job, the approach is relatively straightforward. But the dynamic nature of this flood called for some new ideas.
Here you have to do a lot of logistical planning as you evolve through the process of the response, like how to get to certain areas that have been isolated by the flood by waters and high debris piles. So we're having to basically work our way through some logistics here to try and get to these areas.
We have a road crew in Falmouth and in Butler picking up orphan drums and containers from residential yards and other floodplain areas, and we have a very large crew here just downstream of Falmouth on Monroe's Island picking up more of the larger underground storage tanks, propane tanks, and other containers. This material is commingled with debris, a large portion of it being building material that was washed away from the flood, and we're staging it, and we're going to make preparations to move it out of this area and ultimately dispose of it.
A canine unit was also called in to help search through the debris. At the time, 45 residents still remained unaccounted for, making the potential of uncovering a victim an unfortunate reality. While the land-based crew cleaned up materials that had washed across the floodplain, another EPA team combed the banks of the Licking and Ohio rivers on a barge system, specifically assembled to safely locate, collect, and transport hazardous materials. Typically, a team onshore scoured the banks for orphan drums and containers while the barges drifted alongside. When a drum was discovered, the barge system anchored while the shore team moved the drums to an accessible point. A drum basket attached to a crane on one of the barges was then swung around and lowered to the shore. The drums were loaded into the basket, then hoisted to a hopper barge, where another team staged the materials. To categorize hazardous products, a special quick kit was used. The instrument's color-coded results allowed workers to immediately identify products prior to staging.
You look at this as not quite as unknown drums like as digging up drums on a hazardous waste site. Most of the drums in this area come from petroleum storage facilities or garages that are mostly dealing with automobiles, so you're dealing with basically oils.
Many of the containers being recovered by both the land and water teams were large underground fuel storage tanks that were sucked above ground by the floodwaters.
Probably one of the more unique things that we've observed is just the force or the power behind a rapidly rising river. As you can see with some of the underground storage tanks, these were in place below ground at a facility. They did contain petroleum products and fuel, but yet they're still buoyant enough to be forced from the ground and floated downstream.
To recover these high-capacity tanks from the river utilizing the barges, the team varied the retrieval process, which permitted the tank's contents to be transferred safely.
Today we recovered a 4,000-gallon underground storage tank that was displaced at an open manhole, so we had a technician do a HAZCAT test on it, and we found that it was contaminated with petroleum. So we didn't want to spill the petroleum back in the water, so we took a vac system here on board, sucked out about 100 gallons into a tanker truck compartment, emptied the container, and then lifted the container in the hopper barge.
The drums, containers, and tanks from both remediation teams were then taken to a Kentucky Department of Transportation yard for final categorization, segregation, and disposal.
At that location, they will be separated into a number of groups, one group being propane tanks and home heating oil tanks. We do hope to return those to the companies or the vendors that they originated from, and other tanks and containers of material that we cannot find the proper ownership, we will arrange for disposal of that material.
We've got drums here and drums down through there.
EPA's work in Falmouth helped one community tackle a job that at times seemed hopeless. Unfortunately, spring runoff, coupled with extreme weather in the northern plain states, required another team to assemble just 1 month later in North Dakota.
Flatten them out a little bit so we get a good seal.
We've had a number of floods since 1965, and we've always won. And this was a flood where the predictions were such that we thought we had things in hand. We knew it was a major flood, but it was going to be okay. And all of a sudden it was 5 feet higher than predicted heights, and it just totally inundated the city.
Soaring temperatures on the northern plains in early April 1997 melted a record 10-foot winter snowpack, transforming the Red River of the North into a 40-mile-wide lake. What would become known as the flood of the century in the upper Midwest put 4.5 million acres of North Dakota and North Dakota, where damage estimates topped $1 billion. Many of the city's 50,000 residents had to be evacuated as they tried to hold back the waters.
So we were all working as one agency, if you will. The National Guard, the Coast Guard, and us. We essentially went, neighborhood to neighborhood, evacuating different areas as the night progressed until we eventually ended up all the way over to Washington Street.
Bad went to worse when a section of the city's historic downtown became engulfed in flames. Traditional firefighting tactics proved ineffective against burning buildings surrounded by 5 feet of moving water.
We went to firefighting with crash fire rescue trucks, brought in a chemical drop of fire retardant with a fixed-wing tanker aircraft, brought in a helicopter, and did airdrops. We put 2 of our frontline pumpers on flatbed trailers, and once we got through the fire situation or had that under control, then we started looking at the long-term cleanup aspect.
The cleanup, I think, the more you look at it, the more you realize what a long labor it's going to be. When you go down the streets and see the piles of trash, it's just awesome, the incredible amount of junk that's going to be tossed out and handled.
The magnitude of the cleanup effort was staggering. FEMA The lead agency that oversees disaster relief on a federal level called in EPA to assess and coordinate the cleanup of potentially hazardous materials caused by the flood. EPA, in turn, requested logistical support from the U.S. Coast Guard's Pacific Strike Team.
Are mostly unsafe, underwater, or they have not returned to their homes yet. Whenever they require assistance from the U.S. Coast Guard National Strike Force, they'll give us a call. We'll come in and essentially do whatever is necessary to work up an organization, which in this case would be the Incident Command System. We essentially divide the organization from the OSC, the On-Scene Coordinator, down through safety, outreach programs, and then there's 4 major sections of the ICS system. In each one of those sections, there's been a Coast Guard personnel there just to assist the contractors and EPA personnel who come in to get them on the same mindset with everybody else as far as how the organization should work. Once that's done, it's a pretty much self-sufficient organization.
With the Incident Command System up and running, the first task was identified. Over 200 calls were coming in every day for assistance in the removal of home heating oil from residential basements.
Initially, we pumped oil from heating oil tanks out of basements. We also used absorbent pads. We put it on the oil, on the water, and then we'd take the pads off. We also had to pump the tanks, if there was any left in it. They hold around 250 to 200 gallons of diesel fuel. That was the initial phase.
The tool of choice for removing the oil-water mixture that had accumulated in the fuel tanks were tanker trucks equipped with heavy-duty vacuum systems known as vac trucks. In essence, a supercharged shop vac capable of siphoning off 150 gallons in approximately 25 minutes.
We would have to find a way to get that hose down into the basement. In some cases, it was through doorways. Other cases, we went through basement windows. They have a large Stinger plastic hose or attachment at the end of their hose, and they would stick that down to the tank and they would start pumping. As soon as those vac trucks are full, they are taken into a central staging area and deposited into a frac tank.
The frac tank, a large holding container designed for the oil industry, allowed the oil-water mixture to separate. The water was then processed through Grand Forks wastewater treatment system, and the oil was taken to a petroleum recycling facility. While the oil cleanup continued, another group was focusing on the collection of hazardous household items. Residents were instructed to place consumer quantities of paint, pesticides, and other hazardous household products on the curb, separate from other waste being collected. EPA teams then canvassed Grand Forks neighborhoods, collecting the products and pre-staging the items as they worked. The materials were then transported to a secure staging area, where products were received and segregated. Unknown substances were tested and identified, and like materials bulked. The bulk materials were then restaged for eventual off-site transport and disposal.
Mr. Stromsat, what you see here is this is where the bacteria is growing.
Whenever you have a real high humidity, basement's full of water, when you pump it down, the humidity's still high, a perfect place for spores and funguses to grow. If a person has allergy to these particular spores and so forth, they become very sick, or at least their respiratory problems. We're in the process of taking samples so we know what's there, so we can tell the local populace that, look, when you go down in these areas, be careful. This is what may happen.
3 EPA biological teams sampled flood-damaged homes, schools, and medical clinics for bacteriological and fungal growth. Plans called for follow-up sampling in the winter, when dry and warm interior conditions may cause molds to produce spores, which have much higher concentrations of toxins. Throughout EPA's work in Grand Forks, a positive flow of information and a high level of cooperation were essential ingredients in getting the job done. The people of the region were grateful for the help, especially the opportunity to work as partners.
There's no way in the world that we could have handled 400 basements filled with fuel oil on our own. The Coast Guard people have been top-notch. The EPA folks came in, same situation.
The positive attitude of Grand Forks people, despite the adversities facing them, was an inspiration to everyone. Their stoic pride will certainly help them through the rough work in the months ahead.
We're all very impressed with the people of Grand Forks. They've all bent over backwards to help us, and they've done everything with one thing in mind. Let's get it done practical, and let's get it done quick. They've done a very, very good job.